The biggest threat now facing the continent, it is really radicalization, extremism and terrorism.
African leaders face up to the menace of armed groups on their own soil and beyond their borders. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside Story. I'm Nick Clark. It is a concern uniting presidents and prime ministers across Africa. Leaders are holding a summit in Kenya to hammer out a joint response to what they say is the growing threat of terrorism, particularly the threat from armed groups operating within Africa and from the group known as Islamic State, which has taken over large areas of Iraq and Syria. The worry is that Islamic State could gain a foothold in Africa, use the continent for recruitment and embolden fighters from existing armed groups. Security and intelligence chiefs met in Nairobi on Saturday to address what they call radicalization, extremism and terrorism. With African leaders following that up with a conference on Tuesday, the first such summit organised by the African Union. To our discussion in just a moment, after we hear from Catherine Soy, who's covering the conference in Nairobi.
The leaders in this summit from countries that have been affected by terrorism and are still battling extremists were unanimous in the early sessions of the summit about the need to collaborate, pool resources, strengthen laws. Those who spoke recognize the dangers of radicalizing the huge disenfranchised population of young people who are vulnerable targets of recruitment. They talked of Africa committing its own resources, even as it gets help from outside. They also talked of setting up an African fund to fight terrorism. But some analysts say that all this will come to nothing if bad leadership practices continue. It must be noted that serious challenges, including corruption, bad governance, poorly equipped and disorganized armies in some parts who are fighting extremists in remote areas with terrible infrastructure and across porous borders are making the fight against terrorism in Africa even harder, and those are some of the issues that need to be addressed.
Catherine Soy there. Let's bring in our guest straight away in Nairobi. Mustafa Ali, former Secretary General of the African Council of Religious Leaders and a specialist on conflicts in Africa. Joining us from London is Ayo Johnson, founder and director of Viewpoint Africa. And finally, we're off to the United States. In Houston, Texas, we have David Cook, a professor in religious studies at Rice University and author of the book Understanding Jihad. Welcome, gentlemen, to you all. Good to see you there. Ayo Johnson, if I could start with you first of all. The fact that this meeting is taking place at all is a measure of just how serious the threat is of terrorism being viewed right across Africa.
Yes, terrorism is a major problem for the African continent right now, and a recognition by all the leaders and, of course, under the umbrella of the African Union, which is why this summit has been called. But I must say that the African Union understands that the jihadists are getting tougher. They are becoming that much more daring. They are not slowing down, and the intensity of their attacks against Western operations and Western targets, not to mention the African continent itself, is one that they recognize very seriously. And of course, the Islamic State, or otherwise ISIS, their strength and their abilities that they've shown over the last few months across Iraq and Syria only intensifies that problem when they know that many of these groups who already exist on the African continent are already showing allegiance and support for the Islamic State.
Mustafa Ali in Nairobi, this conference coming on the back, as I said in the introduction, to this convening of Africa's intelligence chiefs over the weekend. And the feeling is very much that African nations need to respond collectively.
That's right. The terrorism in Africa has become a transnational kind of the way groups, non-state actors, both armed and those that are not even armed, are engaging with each other. They are cooperating and they are franchising terrorism, including those groups that are from outside Africa. It is the right time, I guess, that African countries actually cooperate to try and fight terrorism. However, this is coming rather too late, and the only focus on combating terrorism seems not to be sufficient. We need to be focusing more on radicalization into violent extremism, and most countries in Africa are not focusing on the prevention part of this.
So you mean you're talking about the root causes in the first place, a kind of preventative approach rather than just taking it on the ground, as it were?
Yeah, most governments, security agencies have basically been reacting to terror groups when they attack. They've had some kind of offensives against some of these groups, but they've basically been reactive. They've not been spending too much of their efforts and time to address the prevention aspects of it. What is this that is pushing most of these young people into theaters of war to commit acts of terror? This is something that governments and agencies have not done properly.
From the perspective of a continent-wide approach, David Cook in Houston in Texas, how realistic do you think that is? What kind of capacity do these African nations have to act together, or even, dare I say, individually?
The problem right there has to do with the lack of military strength to confront this problem. In Nigeria, for example, with regard to the Boko Haram, the Nigerian army has not demonstrated the ability to actually fight and defeat Boko Haram within its own territory. And Nigeria's army is one of the largest in Africa. So it's an open question as to what exactly are the resources that African countries would bring to bear on this issue. South Africa has a great army, but it's very open to question as to whether it would offer its troops to fight in this particular war. Kenya has had difficulties pursuing the terrorist operations into Somalia.
All right, gentlemen, let's just hold on there for a second. I just want to see who we're dealing with in the kind of the scope and breadth of their reach. Africa's armed groups pose a wider challenge right across the continent, as their influence is often exerted across national borders. You have Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which was established in the Western Sahel, a region of northwestern Africa, notoriously hard to govern. In Nigeria, Boko Haram controls vast territory across the north of the country, but it's also attacked communities in neighboring Cameroon. And Al-Shabaab has destabilized Somalia for years, at one point even controlling the nation's capital. The group's also been linked to attacks in neighboring Kenya and Uganda, and we'll hear a bit more about them and US strikes a little bit later in the program. Mustafa Ali, just set the scene for us. Give us an idea of the origins of groups like Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. Where did they spring from?
A group like Al-Shabaab really gained strength in December of 2006 and early parts of 2007 when Ethiopian forces invaded Somalia. And at that time, the Islamic Courts Union was in power, which was then rooted by the Ethiopians. And most Somalis then rallied around, and young people in Somalia rallied around and a nationalist movement at that time, which was led really by the Al-Shabaab fighters, came into being. And that was when really Al-Shabaab gained strength. And it has been growing in strength over the years to a point when they were controlling large swaths of land and territory in south and central Somalia, right. Controlling Mogadishu and parts of
Okay, and I was just going to jump in there and just so you can kind of tie it up for us. Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, are they affiliated in any way to Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb?
I think Al-Shabaab is one group that has expressed publicly that it has affiliated itself with Al-Qaeda. I don't know about Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. I'm not too sure that Al-Shabaab is affiliated with Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. But Boko Haram, due to proximity there, must be affiliated to groups that are fighting in that part of Africa, including the Ansar Dine group that has been fighting in Mali.
Right, okay, good. That's excellent. I was trying to get an idea of the connectivity of all these groups, which brings us on to Io Johnson. How similar the ideology of those groups that we've just been hearing about in Africa is to the Islamic State, the group that's been gaining swathes of territory in Syria and Iraq, and in terms of the kind of approach that they have, in terms of their brutality in the actions that they take.
Well, one thing is clear is that all the jihadist groups across West Africa, for example, and sub-Saharan Africa have a common ideology, and that's very much about an Islamic State. Their mindset is very similar in terms of using terror to intimidate and to propel that objective. That's clear. But what they will do is that they will take a lot of heart, a lot of energy, a lot of guidance from the Islamic State and ISIS in Iraq, and of course purely because of the speed and the breadth by which that group has been able to take territory, maintain territory, hold territory at the expense of the Americans. And also this is a group which is clearly one of the largest in terms of its depth, but more so in terms of its ability to be able to raise money, which it has done. It has millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, which it has taken from the Iraq banks. And of course, it's already getting at least £1 million a day, or dollars a day from the sale of Iraqi oil. So this is a group that has money. And a lot of these smaller groups in Africa would take a lot of heart, a lot of spirit, that they believe that this group would lead the way, become the new Al-Qaeda in terms of pushing their own common agenda as they see it against the West.
So in that sense, David Cook, they would form collectively a formidable enemy.
I would say that they would, but you must also note that there are certain groups like Boko Haram that are basically local in nature. There's really no good evidence that Boko Haram is connected with the larger Al-Qaeda franchise, as it were. It may be taking ideas from ISIS. I think that its recent establishment of a caliphate definitely indicates that, but its larger aims still remain very closely connected with local Nigerian, local West African issues rather than the larger global Salafi jihadi goal. So
there's no evidence that the Islamic State is so far infiltrating these groups within Africa, I mean, including Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb?
At least Boko Haram. Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb definitely has connections with ISIS. Shabab has definite connections along those lines. But Boko Haram does stand apart in that regard. There's really no good evidence that fighters from outside come and join it, or that it receives strong financial support. What there is evidence is of idea diffusion, that various different ideas that are associated, especially with Iraqi and Syrian radicals, do come into play in Nigeria. I don't think that there's any doubt that during the last weeks, Boko Haram has sought to emulate ISIS as much as it possibly can, given the star value of ISIS's recent accomplishments.
So, Mustafa Ali in Nairobi, do you accept that analysis?
I want to agree with the previous speaker that the groups that we are dealing with here, including Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram, these are local groups. These are local groups that are basing their fight on local grievances. And groups like Al-Shabaab has extended into Kenya, but trying to exploit the challenges that Kenya is facing, including tribalism, land problems, and many other issues, including marginalization and exclusion. So they are exploiting some of those fault lines. And with regard to ISIS, I think it's still very remote at this point in time to think that ISIS is going to have any much effect on the African continent, perhaps in North Africa, but not in sub-Saharan Africa. But what we are going to see is that groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram are probably going to be encouraged by groups like ISIS in the way they are organizing, in the way they are mobilizing resources, so that they can organize themselves better and have some kind of ideological consistency.
Well, it's important we mention at this point in time, one of the groups that we're focusing on, Al-Shabaab, of course, on Monday, its leader was targeted in a US drone strike, and missiles were fired on an Al-Shabaab stronghold in the southern Shabelle region. The US has carried out a number of strikes in Somalia in recent years, part of an increasing US military presence in Africa. David Cook, the US very much part of this initiative to root out extremists. Are we going to see more of this from the United States and from other nations outside of Africa?
I think right now there is a discussion as to what to do, mostly about the two primary groups, the Shabaab and Boko Haram. I see more involvement with regard to Shabaab. It's a long-standing United States interest to be involved in Somalia, at least passively, since 1993. And it's very close to two major allies, Ethiopia and Kenya. So I don't think that there's any doubt that there will be continued United States involvement in Somalia. It's a very open question, however, whether the United States will choose to get involved in the Nigerian issue, which, as I say, that would pretty much only be by invitation from the Nigerian government. And it would be a very open admission of failure on the part of the Nigerian government, which I don't believe that thus far they're willing to make.
And Johnson, realistically, to say the least, this is an incredibly long-term project. You've got to improve a lot of things at grassroots, improve intelligence, stop the spread of ideology. How long is this going to take?
Well, potentially we're looking at a generational loss that's not coming back. We're looking at 25 years at the very least if we start to win the war today. You're looking at trying to ensure that the youths of today do not get involved. They're not enticed to join groups like these. And that means you've got to create jobs, you've got to stop the marginalization. Groups have got to stop to be able to recruit individuals, of which many of our kids are, on the margins of society. How do you ensure that they come back into the mainstream? And I think African governments and their leadership structure and styles are too far distant from creating the environment that enables some of these youths to be able to engage properly with the system rather than fight against it. And I think that's where the problem is. And I think the calling of this conference by the African Union is an indication that African leaders have failed. They have failed to address the root causes, the fundamentals, why people get involved in the first place. And until we can resolve that, the problems themselves are never going to go away, which is why we have a generational problem.
Right, so
which
Mustafa
is going
Ali,
to take at
it's
least
more
the
a
best
question
part of a couple of generations to resolve.
Right, it's more, Mustafa Ali, more a question of governance than anything else.
Yeah, and more than governance, of course, corruption. We're just talking about Nigeria. Why is it that a country with more than 350,000 men under arms have failed to root out Boko Haram, or few thousand ragtag militia fighters? Why is it that they've actually called for outside help from France?
What do you think
Britain?
the answer to that question is?
It is because of corruption. It is because of governance issues.
Okay, well, you've just answered that, so just expand on that.
The resources are really there. I'm sorry, I'm saying the resources are really there for countries such as Nigeria. It's just that these resources just get lost. They are pilfered and do not really go and do the kind of intended work they're supposed to do. The army there has got a huge budget. What is it doing with that huge budget? And secondly, let me say this, that terrorism happens when ideological motivation meets operational capability. I think the previous speaker did talk about the fact that countries have failed to address a number of issues, including socio-political, economic challenges, that young people are quite vulnerable in many respects in many countries across Africa. And that's why they are finding it quite easy to be motivated because of the grievances that are there to join some of these groups. This has got to be addressed by African governments.
So the root cause of that particular issue is corruption, because the money has been siphoned off elsewhere, Johnson. And for many in Africa, the option of joining a terrorist group is actually quite a good one, because it earns them a living apart from anything else.
Well, it provides a financial gain, it gives them security, it provides the level of bonding that they probably are losing and not getting within their existing family structures. And above all, they seem to have a motivation in achieving something, be it that, as far as the world is concerned, is something evil. Yes, I think the youth of today are that much more vulnerable, but is that vulnerability that groups like Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State or ISIS and many other jihadist groups feed on. And until we can resolve the reasons why our youths are still there, then all we're doing is perpetuating the cycle of evilness that maintains this whole structure going. One has to start asking many questions as to who benefits from keeping this cycle going. What we do know is that the wars of some of the armies in the developed countries are maintained. The need for them to be able to use the level of weaponry and sophisticated nature of the intelligence that's required is maintained, but ultimately it's our freedom, the freedoms of every human being worldwide that has to be curtailed to an extent to ensure that we live safely, and that means giving up a lot of our freedoms. And
right,
it's
on
those
that
freedoms
basis,
that are at war.
On that basis, one imagines that the way is wide open for the Islamic State to exploit this vacuum.
It's open season. This could be the worst possible nightmare. What a nightmare it would be. ISIS having the ability to be able to go to an African continent where we've got millions of people who are impoverished, millions of people who are living on the margins of society who would more than likely want to join a group like that. So they've got an endless supply of recruiting capabilities of individuals waiting to join them and to apply terror worldwide. So the problem is going to multiply 100-fold as far as I'm concerned.
Mustafa Ali, I can see you're itching to jump in there.
I don't think we have to lose our freedom. We have to give a part of our freedom in the war against terrorism. You know, at the moment, states, particularly here in Africa, are below the curve. The terrorist groups are above the curve. We need to do this work in a better way. We need to focus on prevention. This is going to take a long time to address. And the more we limit freedoms and the more we clamp down hard on communities, intelligence sources are going to dry up. Communities are going to rise against governments because of the very issues that some of these groups are riding on are actually marginalization, exclusion, bad governance, corruption, all the hallmarks of most of the African governments.
And David Cook, I mentioned this African Centre for Study and Terrorism Research, which met over the weekend, and their finding was that the idea was to give real-time intelligence on suspects and terror cells and so forth. But how practical is that, and how much international help will there have to be to make that happen?
I mean, the fact is that right now that is not very practical. There could be recruitment of intelligence sources that could be happening on a local basis through communities. That's really where the best intelligence comes from in fighting many of these different groups, is through the communities. And once you engage those communities and involve them in the fight against radicalism, because they know who the radicals are, they oftentimes know who gets recruited, who is fighting where, and sometimes even why they are. Because there is a potent combination here. In my opinion, we've talked about a number of different issues. We talked about corruption, poverty, exclusion, marginality. And here we have to also mention things like geography. These sort of groups flourish in areas that are far away from centers, from elites. They oftentimes aren't even being watched. Ideology also plays a part. One can't say that it's a primary part, but one can say that people are attracted to an ideology that is perceived to be victorious. Right now, ISIS and others are riding high. People look at them as being possible victors in society.
Okay, David, I'm just going to jump in there because there's just one last question I want to throw towards...
You know, you could carve out a society like that.
Thank you very much. I just want to throw this last question to Aya Johnson. Do you think a lot of these young people, and very briefly if you would, a lot of these young people who sign up for these groups, do you think the majority of them actually know what they're fighting for?
Not really. But they don't mind. They want to learn something different. They want to be part of a different group. They want to be part of something that shows them to be useful in society, for which, as far as they're concerned, they're not showing any form of use in their society because they got no job, they got no opportunity, they can't show their own creativity. And groups like these provide that blueprint, gives them that ability to explore dangerous and deadly things in a very frightening way.
All right, gents, that, I'm afraid, wraps it up. We've run out of time, but do appreciate your contributions to this very, very interesting discussion. Thanks very much indeed. Mustafa Ali in Nairobi, Ayo Johnson in London, and David Cook in Houston in Texas. Thanks very much indeed. And please do let us know your thoughts on this story by leaving your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or go to @AJ Inside Story on Twitter. I am Nick Clark. From me and the team, goodbye for now.